If you want to see Genesis 1 as creation out of nothing, sure, but I don't know that that's how in the Near East it would have been understood. A lot of times we want to say, "Oh, this is metaphor," but I don't think that the original audience would have just said this is just metaphor. I think the rhetorical force here is that like God has overcome the sea monsters before. And I think Genesis is a really complicated book and with a lot of layers, really a lot of layers to it.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with Philip from Beneath the Bible, and we're going to be talking about Genesis 1. We're going to be talking about the dating. We're going to be talking about Leviathan. We're going to be talking about rainbows. Are they in the Bible? We'll see what Philip thinks on it. Philip, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your background is?
Yeah, hey Zach, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation. My name is Philip Webb. I'm an archaeologist. I have my PhD in archaeology. I live in DFW, Texas, with my wife and 4 kids. And I do co-host Beneath the Bible with my other co-host Kyle.
And can you tell us like what your background is as far as school and education and all that?
Sure. I started this college studying history, and then after that, I wanted to do more. So I went to grad school, got a terminal master's in ancient and medieval history, and from there, I decided to uh, change directions a bit, and I pursued my PhD in archaeology. I studied my dissertation research was on the Bronze Age collapse. I have my super fancy dissertation title, Disaggregation and Regeneration of Sociopolitical Complexity on Cyprus in the Early Iron Age, which doesn't mean much of anything other than I looked at Cyprus, the island of Cyprus in the Early Iron Age, and looked at sociopolitical collapse through the lens of complexity theory. So if you want a copy, I can send you one.
And what have you done since then as far as like work and all that?
So I am kind of on staff. I work on an excavation project in Cyprus at the site of Corion. I'm actually going to be heading out there in about a week. So we were excavating a late Roman site there with my old doctoral advisor. And I've been kind of running Beneath the Bible with Kyle. And I'm mostly stay-at-home dad, really. I kind of get to study what I want to study and pursue what I want to pursue, and I get to hang out with my boys. So I have it pretty good as far as I'm concerned.
So what you're doing right now? Do you end up like writing a lot of papers?
Yeah, I have a couple papers that I'm working on, a couple longer, which we might get into some of what I'm working on here in a little bit. But there's a paper that I presented a couple years ago that is still working towards being published. I have working on our lamp collection that the excavations found, so I'll be working on that for our excavation publication. A couple other papers that are in various states of um, readiness for publication. So I've got a couple of things, but the wheels of academia move slowly. So um, yeah, I got some things working on, but you know, we'll see if uh, what happens with any of them.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So let's just get into it. I want to talk about your general opinions as far as like just the book of Genesis, dating, Torah, um, whether you think it's historical, genealogies, whether literal or symbolic, whatever. Just wondering your opinions on those kind of things.
Sure. Um, so I do think Genesis is history. Um, there's this famous historian who defines a Dutch, I think he's Dutch historian, who defines history as the intellectual form in which a civilization renders account to itself of its past. So that, you know, if that is what history is, but I think that's a fair, in fact, a pretty good assessment of what history is. I think Genesis is certainly history. Uh, but I think the question of is Genesis history? I think what's tied up in that a lot of times is what is the historicity of it versus people are, I think in general, the concern is like what actually happened of it. What would, as we understand history as a academic or journalistic sense of history, which is different than a Near Eastern sense of history, then I think that's the core of that. A lot of times, I don't know if that's kind of what you're hinting at or not, but I think that's kind of at the core of what a lot of these questions about Genesis as history are about. Is what's the historicity of it? What happened? What didn't happen? And I think that's a much more complicated question because I think there are certainly elements of Genesis that would be what we would call historical. I think there are other elements that follow a more mythic pattern, and I don't mean mythic in a pejorative sense in any sense. I have a very positive view of myth and mythic patterns and mythic history. So, um, but as far as the dating of Genesis, I think I really like talking about this. I think Genesis is a really complicated book with a lot of layers, really a lot of layers to it. And there's biblical scholars will have their formulations of it with the documentary hypothesis and JEDP and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of merit to that. Archaeologists can have a somewhat different take on that, uh, but in general, I think that there's a lot of merit to the documentary hypothesis. But when you kind of dig into Genesis, you see elements that are earlier, and you see elements that are clearly later. Um, for example, the you know the Arameans are, or Laban of Aram. The table of Genesis, they talk about a lot of these places, these place names that really are not um, of any significance until the Iron Age. Um, the Arameans do not really differentiate themselves as a distinct people group until after 1200, and yet we have Laban. I think it's Laban um, speaking Aramaic. There's this recognition of the boundary between, Israel and Arameans. So this seems to be a reflection of ninth century uh, historical world. Um, the Table of Nations in Genesis 11. Uh, there's the story of I want to think of Ninurta, and that's Nimrod, who is probably
Yeah.
Ninurta. And Nimrod talks about where he founds all these cities, and one of them is there's Nineveh and Kala, which he calls the Great City. And Kala is only the Great City of Nineveh after Ashurnasirpal II. So this is the ninth century. Um, this would seem to be a ninth century tradition. You can, this is. uh, Some people say, well, this is if this is written by Moses the prophet, he could have predicted all of this, um, which sure, but also this could also be, I think, my understanding, it's more likely that this is reflecting different historical periods. If that does that make, I don't know if that makes sense. That there's the realities that are being expressed in the text, and there's different ones. The blessing of Jacob's blessing of his sons has very archaic language. But even blesses Judah, there's pretty strong foreshadowing that the king will be from Judah. And so is this prophetic, or is this a reflection of um, Davidic? Is this when there's a Davidic king? So is this late Iron 1, early Iron 2, like 10th century or later? Um, and there's also these words that show up in Genesis that are loan words, or um, phrases that show up in Second Temple Judaism, that it doesn't mean that the entire text dates to that period, just that they were maybe reworking part of the text. So again, I'm kind of talking in circles a little bit. I think there's this really long pattern of textual development in Genesis that certainly I think can go back, at least the textual part can at least go back to the 10th century through the 6th century. But then I think there's also oral traditions and cultural memories that go back much earlier than that. The itineraries of the patriarchs, for example, You can put the patriarchs historically maybe in the Middle Bronze Age, and they're moving up and through the Jordan Valley, which if you look at the settlement patterns in the Middle Bronze Age, you have massive amounts of settlements in the Jordan Valley and along the coastal plain. And this seems to be, uh, it fits well with the patriarchal narratives, where Abraham's going and all that kind of stuff. I is, Abraham stands at I with Laban, and, I is a ruin. And that would fit well with Middle Bronze Age. It also fit well later. The site of Et Tel, is an early Bronze Age site, and it was a ruin. You could see it was a ruin. So there's stuff that could fit well with these cultural memories that could go back into the Bronze Age. But I think a lot of the written part of Genesis, um, fits pretty well with Iron Age situations. I don't know if that's clear or not. But it's a lot of picking. It's like picking these phrases out of these passages and be like, this feels like it's Iron Age. This fits the Iron Age pretty well. And then the question is how much of that passage fits. Is, you know, 'Cause I'm quite comfortable with, um, that Genesis changed and evolved over time and, crystallizes into the text that we would recognize in the exilic period, when I think a lot of the text of the Old Testament crystallizes into what we recognize then, but using much earlier Iron Age textual sources. Genesis 1, for example, I think is traditionally called, the priestly creation account. I think there were multiple creation accounts circulating amongst the Israelites and the Judahites, and that Genesis 1 is perhaps the last, the final word on it. Psalm 104, I think, is a much earlier creation account. Genesis 1 follows the pattern of Psalm 104. Um, so I think Genesis 1 is the more refined final iteration of the creation account and harmonizes with all the other ones. Um, and again, I don't know if that causes theological problems for people. I'm not a theologian. Kyle, my co-host Kyle, will tell you that. I am no theologian. Um, but yeah, I think it's a really fascinating text. And looking at, archaeologists, we love our layers, our strata, and so you can look at the text that way, that these different strata within the text. And I think it's a really fun, really interesting exercise to sort of excavate the text that way and look at the different strata that are present and see how God, um, you know, revealed different things at different times. And now we have Genesis, which I think is one of the most incredible pieces of literature, in the world. So
Yeah, so you mentioned Psalm 104, and I'd love to talk about that if you want to show us what you think about it.
Psalm 104 has just been, scholarship has long recognized that this is about creation, and I think it's earlier than Genesis 1. Um, it also has long been connected with the hymn of Aten, the Egyptian text, that there are pretty strong parallels with that. And so, I think the only question is, what is the nature of those parallels, between the Egyptian text and Psalm 104? Um, but I think Psalm 104 is interesting because it has this very functional view of creation. These God makes things, and then the purpose of those things is sort of given there. Um, I think the particularly interesting one is, he makes grapes for the enjoyment of man. Um, Leviathan shows up, in Psalm 104 too, Psalm 104 as well. Um, but it's, these sea monsters, which also show up in Genesis 1, but God puts them in Psalm 104:26. Uh, God puts Leviathan in the sea for it to frolic there. It's not this dangerous monster by any sense. It's just a part of creation that God has put into the sea. Um, which is also kind of what you see in Genesis 1, that God makes the great sea monsters, and they're all commanded to be fruitful and multiply, which is really an incredible countercultural statement in Genesis 1. But and I don't have it like in front of me, or I don't can't be super clear, but um, people have scholars have brought out the parallels between Genesis 1 and Psalm 104, and that the movement of the order that things are made sort of mimic one another between Psalm 104 and Genesis 1. And then Psalm 104 is much more explicit, I think, in the understanding of it's explicit in its Near Eastern cosmology, right? Um, you know, the upper chambers, his beam, he laces the beams of his upper chambers on their waters. Up in there's this clearer sense of that God is residing up above the firmament. The foundations of the earth and the watery deep, and um, it's the the Near Eastern understanding of the world is a little more explicit in Psalm 104 than it is in Genesis 1, but I think it's also in Genesis 1.
Referring to like the conflict idea of see Genesis 1, it seems like there's almost no conflict, but there's hints of it. And then you're saying like in 104, like it's more obvious, but it's still not like where like you got Leviathan being cut in two kind of thing.
Yeah, well, in Psalm 104, I think it's clearer that how the Israelites understood the world, um, that their map of the world, in a sense, is clearer than it is in Genesis 1. Um, but like with the conflict thing, it's notable that there's no conflict in either. Genesis 1 is really interesting because it's setting up that conflict, right? With Tahom is right there at the beginning, um, and with there's this how linked are Tahom and Tiamat? Are they the same thing? Are they different? I am of My opinion is that they share a common root. I don't think that Tahom is like, the Hebrew translation of Tiamat or anything like that. But I think they go back to a common root. There's a really good dissertation on this subject down at UCLA that kind of gets into that. But yeah, I think Tahom is, it's right there, and God's spirit is over the surface of the deep, right? And it's setting up like you're expecting this conflict, you're expecting combat right there at the beginning, and then it never happens. And so that conflict is missing. Um, and then if I can just go into this, the idea of the sea myth or the combat myth. Um, so my understanding of this is you in most Near Eastern creation accounts there is combat or conflict, and out of that conflict emerges the ordering God who, um, as they emerge under that conflict, they create the world. They are made king of the gods, and they are owed a temple. You see this pretty clearly in Babylonian Enuma Elish. You see it also in the Baal cycle. But you also see it in Genesis 1, except there's no conflict. There's, Yahweh comes out, God is just sovereign from the beginning. Tahom is present, but not a threat. The sea monsters are present, but and totally subdued, not no real threat to God. And so, John Walton has done a really good job looking at these all these other patterns in Genesis 1 with the temple, the temple idea, rest, on in Genesis 2:1 that the God rests on day 7, and that the idea of rest, God's rest when they're in their temple. So there, but I think you see all of these things other than conflict in Genesis 1,
Hmm.
um, temple kingship and creation, obviously.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that. That's very fascinating. So, kind of on that thought, if if you're saying that some of these, would you say that that other like creation texts, um, some we'll talk about specifically like regarding Leviathan and all that. Do you think those were also possibly before Genesis 1?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the Ugaritic Baal cycle. so Ugarit was destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. It's one of the fatalities of the Bronze Age collapse, and the city was destroyed. And in the destruction, the clay tablets in the Temple Baal were burned and preserved. And so we have a pretty solid, you know, late 13th century date on those. The Enuma Elish, those, the fullest readings of those, the tablets are relatively late, but pretty much everybody agrees those go much earlier. There's a really interesting debate, at least I think this is interesting. It might be my nerd coming out, but there's this debate of to what extent does the Enuma Elish rely on the West Semitic or the Canaanite or Ugaritic uh, tradition, because Babylon doesn't. It's not by the sea. If you go south to the Persian Gulf, there would have been marshland before you get to the Persian Gulf, and it's really far away from the Mediterranean. So why is the sea this great big, chaotic force in Babylonian myth? Makes sense why it is Ugarit and in the Canaanite city states, right? Because they're maritime cities. So they have very familiar with the sea. And so, but why is Babylon have this? The flood makes perfect sense. Why Babylon has so many flood stories, because the Tigris and Euphrates are have very ferocious floods, and so you can understand how they would have flood narratives. But there's a Finnish scholar who I think, has brought up a good point that it's possible that that the sea myths, or the conflict myths in Babylon, enter into the Mesopotamian or East Semitic world after Sargon the Great. He builds his empire, and he famously dips his weapons in the North Sea and the South Sea, and so he has this empire from essentially the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And after Sargon is when you start to see, or at least Shiaris, and I think quite rightly, that you start to see these sea myth patterns showing up in Mesopotamian uh, mythic traditions. So there's this interesting debate about how much of the Enuma Elish really is derivative of West Semitic mythic traditions. And so then is Genesis 1, it has pretty clear, when you read it and you read Enuma Elish, there seems to be a lot that Genesis 1 is perhaps playing off of, it's at least aware of. And so the question is it sort of like the West Semitic traditions coming into the East Semitic traditions, and then Genesis 1 is playing off of those? Or is it um, that Genesis 1 is really just in dialogue with other West Semitic traditions? We have the Ugaritic Baal cycle, but we don't really have, and this is kind of a problem with talking about Canaanite mythology. We don't really have Canaanite mythology. We have the Ugaritic mythology, and the assumption is that it's roughly analogous to Canaanite mythology, which we don't know if it is or isn't. It probably is, but what kind of creation account did the people of Tyre and Sidon tell, and how similar to the Ugaritic story is it? Um, so we have these gaps in our understanding of these different mythic traditions, and so how is Genesis 1 interacting with them? We just have gaps in that knowledge, and we're still figuring out some of these things. So they have a lot of questions. There's a lot of times you'll see people very confident about, like, oh, Genesis 1 and Enuma Elish 100%. It's like, well, it's, yeah, perhaps, yeah, but it's a really very complicated, the interaction between Genesis 1 and all of the other Near Eastern creation accounts. It's really complex, and I think it's really, I enjoy diving into it and trying to disentangle it. Even though it's not really my expertise, I really enjoy, you know, looking at it, because Genesis 1 is, and I think is very clearly interacting with these other mythic traditions, but it's really distinct from them. It's not so much what it has in common with them, because there's a lot it has in common, but where it's different, it's it's glaring. You know, the lack of conflict for one. Um, that Yahweh is entirely sovereign from the beginning, that the entire cosmos is his temple. So there's no room for any other deities there. It's very clear and explicit. Like the greater light and lesser light being not named, they're not gods, and um, yeah, I think it's a really interesting text and how it's interacting with these other mythic traditions. Sorry if I'm talking in circles.
No, no, that's awesome. So I have two ideas, two questions that come off of that. One, so you mentioned how these other creation texts and psalms probably date back earlier, but obviously, what we're doing here is we are looking at the text, seeing how they compare with, I guess, other texts, maybe looking inside the text to see like what exactly is in that, so we can date it. But with Genesis, you have like these places, you have names, but in these creation texts and Psalms, it's not exactly like that. Like typically, there isn't like a specific name or place. Um, Now Genesis 1, you have it's put in the front of the Bible. When that was put in the front of the Bible or by Moses or whatever, that's a different question. But like, I guess why would you say that? Why can't Genesis 1 be early? What I guess is the question for me.
Part of There are a number of ways I think you could tackle this. Um, One way biblical scholars, at least, will look at this is that they will look at biblical Hebrew, and they have archaic Hebrew, classical Hebrew, and late Hebrew, right? And it's kind of roughly analogous to we have Old English, Middle English, Modern English, and it's all English, but it's very clearly different. Um, and it's less pronounced in Hebrew than it is, like the difference between modern English and old English is like they're unintelligible. It's not the same way in Hebrew, right? But biblical scholars will look at the Hebrew in Genesis and say, okay, a lot of the Hebrew in Genesis is classical Hebrew. It's 8th, 9th century. And the archaic Hebrew is 10th century. And so if you look at Genesis 1, it's more like classical Hebrew than it is archaic Hebrew. And so if the language in Genesis 1 has much more in common with the Hebrew of um, maybe the 8th century than earlier. So that would be more of just when it was written down. If you want to say that this is a much earlier oral tradition, that's different. Um, Oral tradition is hard to pin down on dating. Um, but like a lot of the Enuma Elish, like if it's from the Library of Ashurbanipal, like we can date the context where the tablets were found. Um, so for some of these texts, like we can specifically date. We can say, okay, like we found it here, so at least dates it's at least this old. Um, and then dating the Enuma Elish is tricky, because it seems to be this. There's this political agenda to it of elevating Marduk above the other gods, and so um, why would they want to do that, and when would they want to do that? So generally when you're dating the Enuma Elish, it's okay. When do we see a resurgence of Marduk worship? And so that's um, 6th century with the Chaldean Empire, or you can have it in like the 11th century. There are a couple of times in the earlier Iron Age when it seems like there's Marduk worship is being revived, and so it could be the Enuma Elish dates that early. It could be relatively late. Um, so that's how a lot of these texts are dated. Is like, well, when would this what this text is doing? When would this have been important to say this? Um, so the Enuma Elish and a couple other these creation accounts, they're they're dated that way. And Genesis 1, um, it so it's generally the P source or the priestly creation account. And so the premise in the documentary hypothesis, right, is that these different strands, these different textual traditions that are like the the best example is the J source, the Yahweh source. If you pull out the texts in the Pentateuch that use the name of Yahweh, it creates a fairly coherent narrative. And the priestly source has, some people think it's the redactional layer. It's like stitching all of these things together. There's a really good book came out a few years ago, um, which I can send you the citation. I can send you the PDF if you want. Um, that makes a good argument that the priestly material also is coherent, that it all hangs together very pretty well. If you just look at just the what is traditionally called P source material, it all hangs together pretty well. And so Genesis 1 would be a part of that um, body of literature. And so when the question would then be is when did the priests put together this body of literature? When was it important for them to compile all this literature? And it's usually um, it's when worship is centralized in Jerusalem or after the temple is destroyed and they're trying to preserve these ritual texts in the exile. So that's one reason it's Genesis 1 is traditionally dated to 6th century ish. But there's lots of issues. People have lots of issues with documentary hypothesis, and there's a lot of academics who don't buy into all of it. So um, yeah, it's hard. It can be hard to date texts in the Bible, in part because we're dealing with copies of copies of copies of copies. We don't really have the original. We don't really we don't have the Jerusalem archive, right? If David and Solomon kept an archive, we just don't have it. It'd be awesome if we did. And it'd clear up a lot of things. Probably confuse a lot more things than it cleared up, but we would have, you know, we would have some more answers, which would be really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So you mentioned how, well, one, you mentioned the hymn of Aten. So kind of how it's similar to Psalm 104. But as in my research that I've been studying, these other creation myths and how they compare Genesis 1, I've noticed that there are some scholars that think that the relation of Genesis 1 to other Egyptian texts is way more than the Enuma Elish or any other creation text. Um, and they mention, like, the order of things, specific things that are mentioned, like, spirit and all these other things. Um, like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, why would the Egyptian texts not be more similar than the others?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer um, for that. It's very clear to me that there are certain Egyptian texts that have very strong influence on certain biblical texts, right? The Hymn of Aten and Psalm 104, um, the what's it, instruction of Amenenepe, um, is almost verbatim quoted in Proverbs. So it's very clear that they're familiar. The Israelites, the Hebrew, Judahites, whoever, are familiar with Egyptian literature, some Egyptian literature. So the kind of hang up with the Egyptian religion, Egyptian literature is that Egyptian religion is so closely connected to the land of Egypt that it doesn't travel well, if that makes sense. Um, Baal is kind of um, he can, wherever it rains, you can kind of see people worshiping Baal. But it's hard, like the Nile god, the god of the Nile, like you're not going to see, him being worshipped outside of the Nile. So just in general, Egyptian religion doesn't travel well. Egyptian culture, Egyptian cultural artifacts do. You see scarabs all over archaeologically. They travel a long ways. People would make these scarabs, these little like seals that are in the shape of like a scarab, like a dung beetle, and then they carve hieroglyphs in them, and you'll get these scarabs that have like nonsense hieroglyphics on them because they're just mimicking Egyptian culture, but they don't necessarily have a very good understanding of Egyptian culture, if that makes sense. So, um, yeah, I don't know specifically about Genesis 1 and Egyptian texts. It's, uh, very clear to me that the authors of the Bible, some authors of the Bible were familiar with Egyptian literature. So it's, um, you know, there's this kind of dilemma with finding parallels in the text of like, okay, there's a really good, an interesting article about comparing. We're gonna go a bit further afield, comparing the David and Goliath story with uh, the Iliad, and that there's this combat between two heroes, right? There's David and Goliath on one hand. We're gonna whoever wins is going to be the victor, right? And so people said, "Oh, this sounds a lot like Hector and Achilles and their combat." And it's like, okay, they're these similar tropes, but you kind of have to show that you can't just say like, yeah, these two, like one is copying the other. You kind of have to show like the author of one was familiar with the other one and had access to the other one, and it was culturally relevant enough that they would copy it over. And so you get that, part of why there may be these parallels between Egyptian creation accounts and Israelite ones is, this is how Israel, this is how creation accounts are told. Um, and you could argue the same thing with the Baal cycle or the Enuma Elish, that this is how you tell cosmology in the ancient Near East, and so the Israelites are doing it. They're sticking to that genre and that form, um, and they're not necessarily like having, they're like writing it out with the copy of the Baal cycle right there, and like, oh, this is, you say this, well, we're going to change it this way. It could just be that this is how it's told, how it's written. We know there's a lot of texts that we just aren't preserved, and so again, there's those holes in our knowledge. So all that to say, yeah, there may be very good parallels between Egyptian and Israelite uh, creation accounts, but I can't speak to them specifically. But all that to say, I don't know. Sorry,
Hey,
that's not
that's
helpful.
better than no, that's better than saying, it's better than trying to talk about something you don't know. Um, but uh, so something I've been meaning to talk about. So your specialty is kind of the Bronze Age collapse. So this may or may not be out of your wheelhouse here, but the Genesis text, specifically something like Genesis 4:22, says that um, there were iron, you know, there was iron used to forge instruments, but might be my lack of intelligence here, but if bronze wasn't, or if iron, if sorry, if iron wasn't used before the Bronze Age, then would this be like a really key way to say that this specific part was definitely dated later?
Yeah, I think, so the bronze iron, we call it the Iron Age, we call it the Bronze Age, and these are, our modern periodization terms. It's because you see more iron implements in what we call the Iron Age than in the Bronze Age, but you still see, there still is iron working in the Bronze Age. It's not common, but you'll see it. It was used like in jewelry. It's not used for weaponry, or in the Iron Age you'll find like iron spearheads, iron plows. Like, it was in greater quantities, so it was used for um, more mundane implements. And but you see in the Bronze Age that they did have iron. It's just uh, the technology wasn't as widespread to work iron versus bronze. Um, where my expertise on Cyprus. Cyprus is a very interesting island, and it has huge copper reserves. And so copper was very important on Cyprus, and Cyprus shipped out huge quantities of copper all throughout the Near East. And this may be part of the reason why you uh, don't see bronze being used, because bronze is copper and zinc, copper arsenic alloy. So you see iron showing up more after Cyprus um, essentially collapses, and they're not shipping out copper anymore. So this is a kind of chicken and egg issue of, does Cyprus stop shipping out copper because everybody else collapses and there's no market for it, or does something go sideways on Cyprus and they can't ship out as much copper, and um, I think it's probably because the international market dries up that Cyprus stops shipping it out. But um, yeah, the transition between between copper and bronze working to iron is a interesting discussion, interesting debate. It's um, Robert Drews wrote this very controversial book where he suggests that iron weapons kind of made a lot of the Bronze Age uh, military techniques obsolete. Right? If you can make an iron sword longer than you can make a bronze one because iron's harder. And so you can just have he argues that you have this technological advantage with iron weapons over bronze ones. I don't know that he's right. I don't think that he's right. I don't think he's right in the sense that that's what ends the Bronze Age. But he makes a good point about how iron is superior to bronze in a number of ways. It can hold. Um, you can make longer weapons, and an iron sword can be longer than a bronze sword, um, and iron is much more readily available. You just need to find iron ore, and you can make iron if you can get a furnace hot enough. If you don't need copper for it, and copper is harder to come by. Copper was shipped, you know, from Cyprus to the palaces of the other Near Eastern states. So there's a kind of a democratization with iron that is interesting. But again, that's a bit of a tangent. But when you see iron being mentioned in Genesis, typically it's this is probably pointing to this being a later text, but it doesn't have to be. Um, you do see some iron working in the Bronze Age, but it was, like I said, it's like jewelry. Um, you get some really weird stuff in the Bronze Age. There's King Tut, I think, had like a sword made of meteorite. Like, you get weird stuff. Bronze Age was weird.
So recently, I heard some random person on the internet talk about how the Bible has super sophisticated tools and weapons, and specifically in Genesis, based off this text. So, can you clarify that this text is not evidence for a super early date of Genesis?
Yeah, I would not hang my hat on a very early date of Genesis based off of one reference to iron. That I would not do that
Okay.
personally.
All right. Cool.
Other people do
All
other
right.
things with the text all the time that I wouldn't do, but
Fair enough.
yeah.
Um, Okay, so let's keep going. So yeah, you mentioned in other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, there are, there are a few themes that go together, typically creation, temple building, and some type of conflict between the gods. In the Ball cycle, there's conflict and building of a temple, but there's no mention of creating. And I'm reading through the Ball cycle, looking at different connections with Genesis 1, and all of a sudden I come across this huge debate over like what exactly this is. Um, can you talk about how your view of like, is this creation or is it not in the Ball cycle?
Sure. So, in the Baal cycle, El is called the creator god. It's pretty clear that he El is the father of the gods. He's the one that is credited with being the creator for however that whatever that means. Um, and then as the Baal cycle develops, there's it's told in three stories. The first is the conflict with Yam or the sea. Yam comes into the court of El, and he's this bombastic character, and there's this conflict with Baal, and Baal and his allies fight Yam and his allies, including Leviathan, which we can talk about in a bit. But he defeats Yam, and then in the second story, it's Baal wants to build a temple, so he's going to El to get permission to build a temple. He has Anat, his Baal's wife, goes, and she is supposed to be diplomatic and fails terribly. And then they get Asherah, the wife of El, convinces El that Baal should build a temple, and so that Baal builds this temple, and we get a description of the temple, and um, he yeah, it's so there's he builds a temple in the second story, and then in the third, he is his combat with death with Moat, and um, I believe we're missing the end of that story. That these are fragmentary stories. We don't have the end. But as the as Baal and Moat go in and fight, El has this dream where he sees what the world will be if Baal is not returned to the land of the living and is not made the king of the gods, and it's um, the land is suffering, the land is dry and parched, and so he comes to Moat and he says, "I will not support." Basically, says, "I won't support you as king of the gods. You have to let Baal be the king of the gods." So it's not clear, it's there's none of this like splitting of Yom to make the earth where like that's all the world is pretty much all already there. And so in there are a number of ways that people interpret the Baal cycle, and the cosmogonic reading would see that one when Baal builds a temple, um, there's and again John Walton talks about this. There's a number of other scholars talk about how the building of a temple is to build a universe in a sense, and so that this is there's a sense that this is like there's a creative act in the building of the temple. So that's there, but also there's this sense of this distinction between creatio prima and creatio continua. That El may be the initial creator god, but Baal is the one who sustains it, and that this sustaining of creation is a no less creative act than the initial act of creation by El. And so this is the that Baal is the one who sustains creation from his temple that hits this. And this is kind of hinted at in Genesis 2, where God rests. And rest is always done in a temple, and rest is there's a different perspectives on what divine rest is. But I think there's something to this idea that rest is the resumption of normative behavior, resumption of uh, normative things. And so this is the sustaining of creation in a sense. So in Genesis 1, you could see both the creatio prima and creatio continua, that this initial creative act and then the sustaining of it is done as part of God's rest. And in the Baal cycle, that's if there is a creative component to it, it's probably that creatio continua of Baal. And El sees if Baal is not allowed to be the king of the gods, then the world will suffer and die. And so Baal is sustaining it. And so there's a book, Myth, History, and Metaphor, by Paul Cho, who outlines that. I really like Paul Cho's formulation of it. I think he's spot on a number of things, at least.
Right. So that gets into kind of like what exactly is creation. So, I mean, the average American will, when they see Genesis 1, they'll be like, okay, material creation. Someone like John Walton doesn't think it's material creation. Someone like John Walton thinks it's some type of bringing disorder to order, or
Yeah.
non-order, whatever. What would you say about that?
Yeah, the creation out of nothing, I think is biblical. I think like John Walton, it's like but I think you can get it out of Colossians. You don't need to get it out of Genesis 1. Um, because I've run into this a couple times where you get these. You look up, what is the word that is used for God made this. Like I think it's bara,
Yep. Hmm.
or he made this. And so you look it up in the lexicon and it's like this, it has all the different meanings. And it's like, well, in Genesis 1, it means to make out of nothing, because in Genesis 1, it means to make out of, it's this very cyclical, like, the lexicon has this cyclical interpretation to it. They say the word means something because in this passage it means that. And it's like, I don't know that they've proven that. Um, so ran into this. Kyle and I worked on a thing on um, the the rainbow at the end of the flood, which we can maybe talk about here in a little bit. But um, the word keshet, it pretty much always means like a bow, like a hunter's bow or a warrior's bow. Um, Except in Ezekiel, there's this reference, this word is used and it means a bow. And they're also like, oh, and in Genesis 9, it means a rainbow too, because in Genesis 9, it means a rainbow. Like there's this cyclical, um, like you see this word in the text, you look it up in the lexicon and it says it means something because in this passage, that's what it means. It's not a, I don't know, I don't know if I'm being very clear on this. Um, But I think you get that in Genesis 1 where it's like you start with this theological interpretation that this means creation out of nothing, and so the word then has to mean to make out of nothing, even though that's not really how that word is used anywhere else. And so, if you wanna see Genesis 1 as creation out of nothing, um, sure, but I don't know that that's how, in the Near East, it would have been understood. Again, I think behind that is sort of sitting right behind that is this assumption that this very materialist assumption that the matter of the universe is the most real thing, and so this is what God has to make at the beginning. And I don't know that that's an assumption that would have been shared in the ancient world. Um, and there's much, and again, I think there's much more interesting things going on in Genesis 1 than the origin of matter. That's a very modern preoccupation. Um, and it's not something that I think was, and I wasn't really concerned that was shared with us in the ancient world. Um, they're doing much more interesting things, in my opinion, um, with Genesis 1 and the making of the world. And I think you've talked about this other times on our channel. It's this separation and naming, and um, it's I don't know. It seems like there's a lot more going on than just speaking things from nothing into something. There's separating and pulling what's existing and giving it form and function, and giving it purpose. And go back to Psalm 104. That seems to be how that earlier creation story is told. It's everything is very functional, and you get that, I think, in Genesis 1 too. It's a form and function and order are all tied up into this. And and the making it out of nothing is sort of like, well, maybe, but maybe not. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't. I don't, I'm not hung up on it. Um, but I get what I fully get why people are, and it's a important and valid exploration for sure. Um, but I just don't know that that's necessarily a question or a concern for the ancient Near Eastern world.
Yeah. So this is interesting. So um, there's a text. I think it's found in Babylon. It's called "When Anu Began to Create the Heavens" or something like that, and it it shares its details. It's basically it's like it explains how it creates the heavens and the earth and some other stuff, and then it creates a bunch of gods. So if you look at that specific text, it looks like, okay, it's just doing creation. Well, until you understand what the god stood for, which were all building materials, and it's like, okay, that's super interesting. Like, why is it only focused on building stuff? Well, it's describing like the temple, and apparently it was used to as like a spell or whatever to protect the temple from demons or something like that. And um, I in my next video for Genesis as a temple inauguration, like I'm going to put it at the front, and it's going to be like imagine if this was at the front of our Bible instead of like what we have now. So it's specifically like 104 maybe, where it's more function oriented. And it's like, what if that was at the front of the Bible? Like, would we have different views on it now? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, nothing specific. I think that's a really good. I mean, you bring up a very interesting point there. That yeah, it's part of it is that we don't share the same worldview, which so we're thousands of years apart. Things, different culture, different time, um, and when we don't share that same worldview, like we just miss stuff. and it's hard to recover. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things with those Mesopotamian temples, and I was just talking with a friend just last night even about there's this Mesopotamian text about like when you remove a tooth for a toothache, like a medical text. But when you do that, like you have to recite part of the creation story because you're like removing the disorder so that the new can come in. And it's like this it's not just these stories would have been repeated and um, at New Year's festivals, and it's just we don't share that same world, and so we just miss a lot. And I know I it's like every time I kind of go back into studying this, I find something new that's like, oh, I hadn't considered this, or there's another text. You're like, oh, this is interesting how these are similar or whatever. There's you know you could spend forever in Genesis 1, and it's really Genesis is a really incredible incredible book.
So you said how like some of these creation myths would have almost ulterior motives compared to like how we would see it. Like, we think of creation, we think of, oh, it's just recounting a historical event at the beginning of the time, which is like, okay, that's cool if it's historical, but I guess like what was the purpose of it? And like we don't typically think of like what was the purpose of Genesis 1 or any of these other texts. So it seems like you're making the inference that because a lot of these other creation texts were used for other purposes, that you'd say that Genesis 1 was possibly used for that. Is that what you're trying to say here?
Well, for sure, the Enuma Elish is it's called the Babylonian creation account, and a lot of Mesopotamian scholars kind of don't like that because it's not primarily a creation account, right? A lot of these creation accounts are not really primarily creation accounts. That the Enuma Elish was part of the New Year's festival, and this is tied up with the renewal of the year. I had this really great conversation with a friend yesterday. Um, this idea of sacred time, and that there these these rituals that were these texts would have been used in, the sort of like the community is stepping into sacred time and reenacting these rituals, and you're taking part in these things. And it's it's not just a story that existed. It was um part of at least yearly ritual. Would have been at least for the Mesopotamian stories, these would have been used, um like they would have been encountered frequently. They are again associated with temples and kingship and the renewal of creation every year. And it's just sorry, I'm still, like I said, every time I sort of get back into this, you find new things to wrap your head around. And I'm not being particularly eloquent or clear here because I'm still wrapping my head around a lot of this idea of sacred time and how these creation accounts would have been incorporated into these festivals. Um, and to what extent, and this is kind of an ongoing issue, uh, to what extent did the Israelites have the same sort of New Year's festival, or to what extent would these creation accounts have been played out, or had what role did they have in um, ritual or liturgy? That's not entirely clear. Um, I think they probably did have a kind of annual New Year's festival of some sort. I think there are hints of that, particularly in the Psalms. Um, there's some good books that talk about this. Um, because part of the problem is after the destruction of the temple, some of these rituals are not relevant anymore, um, so they don't get preserved in the same way, but you get echoes of them. Yeah, no, it's clear that some of these creation accounts were certainly more than just creation accounts. That they had much deeper meaning for the communities that produced them. And to what extent Genesis 1 is like that is a very good question, and I don't have a good answer for.
Yeah, no. Well, I've been researching So someone like Jeff Morrow wrote a paper on Genesis as a temple inauguration, but he also talks about how like all the mentions of sevens and like the how it could also be used as a liturgical text based on things like in day 4 where it talks about like making the calendar and like that's how we would track like how to do the different temple or different festivals and all like that kind of stuff. To keep going, so let's move to Psalm 74. I'm going to pull it up here. So yeah, I mean, obviously there's other creation texts, there's other mentions of Leviathan and Psalms and other parts of the Bible,
Mhm.
but specifically in Psalm 74, so it says, "But God has been my king from ancient times, performing acts of deliverance on the earth. You destroyed the sea by your strength, and you shattered the heads of the sea monster in the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You fed him to the people who live along the coast. You broke open the spring and the stream. You dried up perpetually flowing rivers. You established the cycle of day and night. You put the moon and sun in place. You set up all the boundaries of the earth. You created the cycle of summer and winter." So this obviously has a lot of creation language. Leviathan's in there, um, but it's obviously very different than Genesis 1. You mentioned how other parts of Psalms have, you know, are these, possibly these creation accounts other than Genesis. Um, but, most Christians don't think that, at the beginning of time that God was slaying Leviathan, cutting him two or whatever. Like, what do you think's going on here?
Right. So, I'm gonna this is one of the projects I'm kind of working through. So this is a Psalm of Asaph, right? There's a handful of these Psalms of Asaph, and uh, it's there's with all things biblical, there's debate about who or what the Asaphites are. I think there's a strong case to be made. The Asaphites were a Levitical clan, and there's a interesting book that suggests they were from Israel as opposed to Judah, and that they were involved in the preservation of Yahwistic liturgy and texts in the Northern Kingdom, and that after the fall of the destruction of Bethel, fall of Samaria, fall of the Northern Kingdom, the Asaphites come south into Judah, and that is archaeologically it's very clear after the fall of Israel, Jerusalem expands quite significantly. That there's very clearly refugees from the north that come to Judah, and um, so there's one argument then is that this psalm is a originally would have been a composition about the fall of Bethel. Um, Traditionally, it's seen as a sort of lament for the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And so, what I think is happening here, um, the first part of the psalm is, all about the destruction of, it's, um, people coming in and burning down the sanctuary. Um, and then it takes this turn in verse 12, but God is my king from of old. This from of old is this euphemism for since creation. And again, so there's a reference to kingship. God is my king. So this is all tied up. It's evoking this sea myth imagery again, and it's essentially it's saying like, look, we have encountered chaos, we've encountered disorder with the destruction of this temple, and so there's this beautiful turn, right, in that verse 12 of but God my king is from of old, and then it recounts the parts of the sea myth, um, about the destruction of Leviathan and splitting open, splitting the sea and establishing boundaries, um, and so I think it's less a creation account than it is it's saying we've encountered chaos uh, here, but I have faith in God that uh, He will overcome the chaos we're experiencing now because He has done it in the past. Um, and I bring up the fact that this might be Israelite as opposed to Judahite because it seems the Israelites may have been more comfortable with some of these sea myth metaphors with Leviathan and um, all these again sea myth metaphors that we're talking about that they would have been more comfortable in Israel versus Judah, and that the influence of the Phoenicians and the the Canaanite city states that Israel had more connections with, that this may have entered into Israel that way. And again, I don't know, you know, to what extent is this metaphor versus, a lot of times we want to say, oh, this is metaphor, but I don't think that the original audience would have just said this is just metaphor. I think, you know, the rhetorical force here is that like God has overcome the sea monsters before. God has overcome the forces of disorder. And so if he's done it before, he can do it again. Right, and it has this, in verse 22, "Rise up, O God, and defend your cause." This idea that he's resting, um, when he shouldn't be, right? You can't that God cannot rest, when there's chaos afoot, right? He has to rise up and overcome chaos again. Um, and I think that's kind of what's happening, and to me, and that's maybe not kind of what you're getting at, but to me, what's so beautiful about Psalm 74 is this. We all encounter chaos, various levels. We all encounter it at some point in our life, and that refrain, "God, my King, is from of old," um, and He's overcome chaos before, so He can rise up and do it again. So that's why I love Psalm 74. I don't know to what extent they they see this as the creation account, that to what extent this is a creation account versus um everybody's familiar with the sea myth, and so this we're citing it here because everybody knows it, so we're going to cite it. um how much of it is that versus how much of this is orthodox Yahwism? Is it, I don't know. I don't know how much of this is like the orthodox position versus everybody knows these chaos metaphors. Everybody knows this story, so we're referencing it here. I don't know if that makes makes sense or not. Um, but you see these chaos metaphors get confused too. There's another psalm where it's not clear if they're talking about creation or the Exodus. Right? It's has this very confusing language where some, like in one phrase it seems to be talking about the Exodus, and the next line it seems to be talking about creation, and it goes back and forth. And it's, modern interpreters are, it's like, well, is this creation or is this the Exodus? And I think the point is that it's both, right? That God, that these chaos metaphors are used because God splits the waters, and uh at the beginning of time, he splits the waters and makes the world, but also in the Exodus, he splits the waters and he makes Israel out of it, right? That there's the birth of the the creation of the world and the creation of his people, that these are conflated and they're entangled in a way that are really not meant to be disentangled, and that's the point. Um, which I think is real. It's a very it makes perfect sense in the ancient world, and it's very hard. It's very hard on my brain to be like, like I want clear, like this is creation, this is Exodus, and but yeah, I don't think those are meant to be disentangled all the time. And so, how much of these metaphors are being used because people know them and they have cultural salience versus this is what was orthodoxy is, I don't know.
When you
That's
mean
I
orthodoxy, yeah, I was
well
gonna say, when you mean orthodoxy, you don't mean like the past 2,000 years. You mean before that.
yeah, yeah. So as Yahwism is, there's this um yeah, how to so the prophets have, in classical prophecy there's all these worship at the temple, this aniconic uh version of Yahwism. That's not how Yahwism always was. There's this clear development, right? Of, Abraham and the patriarchs knew God by the name of El, and then God reveals His name to Moses, and so there's this development of of Yahwism. There's in Exodus, it's very clear. It's like, it's when you worship me, build an altar of uncut stones. There's not. It's clear that they're not meant to only worship at Jerusalem, right? There's provisions of how to worship God other places, and so this as this orthodoxy develops towards centralization at Jerusalem, and it's aniconic, and it's all these different things. Um, to what extent the sea myth elements of the sea myth are orthodox or become unorthodox, like that's the development of those ideas is not clear to me. I'll say that. I don't know if that clears anything up or not,
Yeah,
but
no, that makes sense.
you have that
Um,
clear, like, you know, I don't know which way is left and right on the screen, but there's this movement from we move towards Orthodox Yahwism, or what the old we have this like coherent Yahwism that we get at the end of the old, by the time the Old Testament is solidified, we have this fairly coherent picture of what Yahwism is, and it's you know, but we get indications that there was Ashra worship and Baal worship and all these kind of other things that were a part of Israelite custom and practice. And so, to what extent were certain things tolerated, and for how long were they tolerated? Um, and a lot of the sea myth stuff, like this is still, it's part of Christian tradition. Like, I think these metaphors of chaos are still relevant, and I think they're incredibly powerful and incredibly salient today. I love talking sea myth stuff, so you're gonna have to stop me before we go on for too long. But I think it's you know really incredible stuff, and it shows up in a lot of the Psalms, and it shows up it shows up in you know Jesus calming the waters, and it shows up. Early Christian tradition sees a lot of the sea myth in like baptism and the death and resurrection. Like, it's these old motifs are come back in a big way, um, and so you see them in Genesis, you see them in Psalms, and they I know that's I'm piecing all of this together. Uh, but I came to these mythic patterns, mythic traditions relatively late in my academic studies, so I'm still a bit of a novice in where all these stuff come, where we see all these things. But I'm having a lot of fun in the exploration of it. So
Hey, that's awesome. And something you mentioned is for like how, you know, you could talk about like, sea myth and Leviathan and, Genesis 1. Like something I like about you guys' channel is that not only do you give this like, here's the facts, here are what the ancient Israelites might have believed, but there's also some significance for us. In this case, it's that, chaos, God can conquer that. And
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of archaeology that's like, it's you can study this, and it's like, oh, that's neat, I guess. Um, but why do people need to know it unless you're an archaeologist? And there's a lot of archaeology that people don't need to know. Like, nobody needs to know cooking pot rim typologies, right? Like, nobody needs to know that. I barely need to know that. I do. But there's a lot of stuff that just is not really relevant to a lot of Christians. But then there's stuff that I think you can draw important things out. The archaeology and biblical studies, that it brings perspectives, and it's part of that culture that we're not a part of, and it can help clarify some things. Sometimes there's some weird stuff. There's really weird stuff in the Old Testament, right? And sometimes archaeology can be like, oh, well, this is you're kind of missing something here, and archaeology can provide some of that context that has been really I've really enjoyed uncovering that. And I learn something new all the time.
Awesome. Okay. One more thing I want to talk about before I let you go. You guys did a really great video on Genesis 9 in regards to the rainbow, and how every person I've ever talked to growing up who even mentioned this, it's like, it's a sign from God, the rainbow in the sky. This is the first time there's ever been a rainbow, and you guys take a different approach to it. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so, alluded to a little bit earlier, but everywhere else, this word, God, it says God puts his bow in the sky. Um, and there's a number of scholars have highlighted the sort of tension here, and we're following other scholars' work mostly. It's in that video description, so I don't have the citations handy. But what they highlight is that this reference to the bow everywhere else is like a bow and arrow. It's an archer's bow. It's a hunter's bow. Um, it's That's how it's pretty much always used. In Ezekiel 1, I think it's is the only very clear reference to this being a rainbow. It talks about like a bow with many colors, right? It's clear that this is a rainbow. But these a number of scholars have brought up that just because of the latitude of the Near East, they don't get a lot of rainbows. You need the light to refract a particular way, so it's not a particularly common sign. It's not a particularly common phenomenon, and it comes after the rain. Um, like it's when there's still moisture in the air and the sun hits it, you see the rainbow. So as a sign from God that like he says, I'll put my bow in the sky and remember not to destroy the earth by water. Um, you would, as on the human side of things, you would hope that that symbol would be present more frequently and before the rain, right? You don't want this to either to be rain clouds and then later after the rain has finished that there's this symbol of this sign from God. So a number of scholars have suggested that this is again, because in the flood there's this again these sea myth motifs that the flood is in a lot of ways an act of uncreation. It's the chaotic waters coming back. It's Tahom, God unleashes Tahom and the waters come up, and so then but then the waters are subdued again, and God makes this promise not to do that again. And so a number of scholars suggest that this is not the rainbow, but it's actually God's bow, as if like a bow and arrow. If God was a warrior, which he's a number of other places depicted as, that this was God's bow, that God is putting his bow in in between him and earth. So there's, again in the Enuma Elish, Marduk's bow is like deified and put in the heavens as a star. It's called the bow star. It's part of a constellation, and so there's a number of scholars who suggest that this bow that God puts in the heavens between Himself and Earth is actually a constellation or it's a star that would have been visible um, much more frequently than a rainbow would be. So it's one of those things where if you're really committed to the rainbow interpretation, you still this is one of those things that there's wiggle room, I think, in the interpretation. If you think it's a star and a constellation, there's good precedent for that. There's this really interesting. The British Museum has this called the Broken Obelisk, and it's an obelisk that's missing the top part, and what you see is this king who has captives in front of him, and there's this solar disk, the god in the solar disk, and then he's handing a gesture. There's like a gesture of blessing with one hand, and then the other hand is a bow. Um, so there's perhaps a good depiction of a deity putting his bow in the sky. Um, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting parallels there. And as Kyle and I were working on this, I'm like, I really like this idea that this is a star, and Kyle's like, yeah, I kind of think it might still be a rainbow. Um, and I don't know who knows who's right. That's we like to do that. Over on our channel, we like to kind of look at different interpretations and different things that are more sometimes it's easy to miss cultural things, and if we can highlight some of those, that's we that's our bread and butter.
Yeah, that was actually almost comical during the video. You guys were like, "Yeah, I think it was a bow, and I think it was a rainbow." It's like, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
but yeah, yeah.
That's funny. All right. Well, Philip, is there anything else you wanted to add in regards to all we talked about?
No, I thanks for letting me ramble. I love talking about this stuff. So thanks for having me on. I love what you're putting on. So keep up the good work. Thanks for having me. I know Kyle wishes he could make it. He's a pastor and stuff comes up, so he couldn't make
Yeah.
it today. But yeah, thanks for having me. I love the conversation. So
Yeah.
appreciate it.
No, this is a lot of fun. I learned some stuff. Hey, so uh, is there anything besides your YouTube channel where people can get connected to you? Obviously, you have your dissertation. Any books or anything like that you plan on writing?
Um, I have plans. I have 4 kids, so, I have a lot of things I'd like to do, but, haven't haven't been able to get them out yet. But, for now, you can find, youtube.com/ beneath the Bible. We have a website that we're working on, updating a bit, beneaththebible.com. While I'm on my excavation, we are gonna be posting on Instagram, which is I think just at beneath the Bible. Um, and we'll post pictures of our excavation, and we'll kind of have a what it's like on a dig kind of a thing. So if you're ever curious on what it's like on an excavation, we'll be posting from Cyprus this summer. So you can check us out.
That is super, super cool. And I definitely might have to take you up on interviewing you again on that topic. That'd be super cool.
Yeah, I'd love it.
Awesome, man. All right. Well, appreciate it, Philip. And I hope you have a good day. Hope everyone enjoyed. And I'll talk to you later, man.
All right, thanks. You too.